Professor Abolo, good morning and welcome to the program.
Good morning. Thank you very much for inviting me. Very grateful. Thank you.
Great. So when we look at our debt status in the country, I know that the last report that the CBN shared gave a bit of hope that the debt reduction has reduced. But when we see the yields, we saw yields depreciating and then we see it increasing again. A lot of people have said that this is because the government wants to attract especially FPIs. But what do you see from where you're sitting at the debt situation, sustainability especially in the country?
Well, thank you very much. The debt situation in the country appears to be very worrying, and that is the general consensus amongst experts and economists and other policy makers in this country. But let's be very clear. We need to interrogate the data before anyone can draw any conclusion. I want to say that the debt profile of Nigeria, talking in terms of both the public debt, both external debt and domestic debt, the figures we have on the website of the Debt Management Office, because that is the most authoritative data anyone can speak to. We have it as of September 30th, 2024. There's no figure even as of December 2024. But that is not an indictment. It was just simply to say that the kind of interrogation one is given here is based on the best available information on Nigerians' public debt. But permit me to just look at the situation as of December, that is Q4 of 2024, for us to have a very clear picture and be able to draw the right conclusion. Well, Nigeria's total debt as of December 2024 was put at 116 trillion naira, which translates to about 124 billion US dollars, which is broken down into federal debt of 105.6 trillion naira, and state governments 11.2 trillion naira. So what one would observe at that point is that year on year, between 2023 and 2024, there was a massive jump, of 20% increase in Nigeria's public debt. But more concerning is the issue of the debt to GDP ratio, which is currently put at about 45%, which is higher than the 40% that was recorded, in 2023. But the argument has always been that this is within the threshold of the IMF, definition of any country that has, debt, concern, or what you also refer to as debt sustainability. Now, the debt service, that is the area we should focus on. The debt service to the revenue ratio is over 100%. That means, our total revenue is being used to finance debt. So there's nothing left, for execution of government projects. That means we're likely to continuously be, in a borrowing mode, because the revenue that we are generating as a country is even not sufficient to service our debt obligations. Now, let me try to, so that we have a very clear picture for everyone to draw his own conclusion. Now, the total domestic debt of Nigeria was put at about 65.4 trillion, which accounts for about 56% of the total debt of Nigeria. In which case, about 44% of it is external debt. Let's look at the details so we'll be able to interrogate this issue. In terms of the domestic debt of Nigeria, which I talked about, 65.4 trillion, the FGM bonds accounts for about 45 trillion. Bond issuance, 45 trillion. Treasury bills that was raised by government through open market operations, 8 trillion. And then of course the usual, the CBN ways and means. CBN ways and means account for 12.4 trillion. And this 12.4 trillion is still securitized.
Prof, so we're not just, reeling out numbers. let's give some flesh to this. Of course, you did talk about the treasury bills, the bonds, and I mean, we hear oversubscription in the fixed income market, and we see our inflation, and then we see the NPR, and of course, all of these are connected. So we've seen the government go to the domestic market, that's talking about the bonds, obviously, and the treasury bonds and all of that you talked about. We've seen them, and we've counted it as, will I say, a better evil or a lesser evil, because it should cost the government less to borrow from the domestic market while also achieving the FPIs. We could have FX inflows, especially from the NTB. So why don't we just not look at the numbers that way and try to balance it out with the impact on the economy? Would you say that there's a balance, or we're on at least a right trajectory? Because going to the domestic market means the government doesn't have to borrow in dollars, and that reduces debt servicing at the end of the day.
Thank you very much for that intervention. Well, I would say that there is, resorting to borrowing domestically makes a lot of sense, because when you borrow externally, because of the devaluation of the currency from 405 naira to a dollar to now about 1,500. Over 500 naira to a dollar. That's going to be a major strain. So the government is wise resorting to domestic borrowing. The total budget deficit financing of government is quite huge, and then of course the refinancing, rolling over the maturity matured bonds and the treasury bills has also imposed a lot of strains on government. And so what the government is trying to do is to try to avoid costly external debt in terms of euro bonds rates, which remain at about 10 to 12%. So government is quite wise, is taking the right step in saying that let's look inwards to be able to finance our deficit. So resorting to domestic financing, I don't think is bad in itself. So that's the kind of delicate balancing which the government is trying to maintain, rather than resorting to external borrowing. And let's also not forget Eurobonds, some of them are maturing. I think about 3.2 billion maturing early this year, before June. So let's be very clear, the government is taking the right step in focusing on domestic borrowing. But while doing that also, we also need to advise government that, of course, the cost of governance has to be reduced, in order to reduce the fiscal deficit of government position, so as to have an economy that is working at optimal level.
So we see that deficit of more than 13 trillion, but we've seen some changes happen from the oil space. Brent is less than $75 now. The exchange rates, the budget has it at about 1,500. We know it's dropped a bit less than, even though it's not up to 1,600. How can we expect these changes to affect that deficit? Also knowing that at least for now, Russia and Ukraine have agreed, there's a kind of a peace going on there, peace talks, that may bring back Russian oil into the market, and that means cheaper oil globally. So how will this affect that over 13 trillion naira deficit that we already have?
Yes, I think the truth that is, the truth that we are beginning to get, the signal we are getting between Russia and Ukraine, signals that the oil situation is not likely to, is likely to be favorable to Nigeria. Remember, the objective of, America was to talk to Saudi Arabia and some other countries to make sure that they reduce, the price of oil, so that because, Russia appears to be financing the war, through, high price of petroleum. So what the Americans wanted to do was to make sure that they reduce the price of oil, so that, and given that the assumption of the oil price that we use for our budget was around $70, now that situation has been put on hold in terms of not, reducing oil price because of the truce, I think that is going to be favorable for Nigeria, and it's going to assist the government in being able to meet its debt obligations and finance the deficit of the budget deficit. So it's something that is very positive for Nigeria.
All right. So talking about the sustainability, debt sustainability, I mean, it's a common say that I mean, there's nothing wrong with actually borrowing and all of that. But what are you using it for? What about the productivity? How would you measure Nigeria's debts and borrowings to our productivity?
Well, thank you. Well, when we talk about debt sustainability, even though let's be very clear, Nigeria has not fallen below what is appropriate under the IMF requirements of what is what is unsustainable. But debt sustainability simply refers to a situation where a country is not able to manage its debt obligations, both principal and interest, without requiring excessive adjustments in terms of drastic spending costs, tax hikes, or debt defaults. So the rating that Nigeria currently has is we are still in a comfortable situation, even a lot better than so many African countries. So I think what needs to be done is that the government needs to reduce public spending, because when you reduce public spending, you will find that if you're looking at I don't want to go into LM and IS costs. When you reduce public spending, according to the fiscal argument, is that the liquidity that comes into the system will be reduced, and that will help to curb inflation. So it will be a good thing for government to reduce public spending, cut down on the cost of governance, so as to reduce liquidity in the system. And when you reduce liquidity in the system, that will transmit into the system in terms of reducing inflation. I also need to mention that it has been argued very successfully that the inflationary situation in Nigeria is purely not a monetary issue; it's structural. So if it is structural, we argue for a situation where the Central Bank of Nigeria and also the fiscal arm of Nigeria they coordinate in such a way as to bring down inflation in this country. So it is purely not a monetary phenomenon.
All right, Professor, when you say government should cut expenditure, what in practical ways? Is it reduce offices, because we've had this conversation a couple of times, even though we haven't seen anything really done about it. But what, from your perspective, would equate to reducing government spending?
Well, I may not have the statistics, but generally everyone agrees that the level of corruption in Nigeria is quite high. And if we look at the corruption index, it simply shows that we have not improved. So a lot of the so-called expenditure we are referencing, is in terms of corruption. So we need to plug. That has been an issue. We need to plug these holes to make sure that corruption is reduced to the barest minimum. Even some have also argued the money we are borrowing, where is it? People say they can't see the money that is being borrowed. So let's plug that hole called corruption. If we plug that hole, I think we have sufficient resources in this country to be able to grow the economy. But it doesn't make sense. You're borrowing and we're not seeing the impact. That is where many Nigerians are raising concerns. So let's cut down on the cost of governance. But I'm not going to sit here and say, okay, reduce ministries, reduce that. The Orozonye report is already there. A lot can be taken from there. So he has said it, let me say, several years ago, that we need to reduce duplication of ministries, departments, and agencies. That way, then we get serious. Then, of course, let's also make the point that many of the ministries and departments are just mere duplications. They are just mere duplications. Let us reduce the cost of governance. Let us reduce corruption. That is the only way we can have an optimal level of government performance in Nigeria.
All right, Professor Emmanuel Abolo, Director General, the Economic Think Tank Center. Thank you so much for your time and your views this morning.
Thank you very much. It's my pleasure.